be careful, please. There's literally a load of babies here. Please be careful. Please be
May
careful.
2024, dawn broke quietly over Tufnell Park, North London. The narrow streets, lined with terraced houses, stirred with ordinary life. Commuters heading for trains. Children hurrying to school. Yet that morning, something far from ordinary was about to unfold. Parked discreetly along the street were vans filled with Metropolitan Police officers in tactical gear. They had not come for a young gang or a violent crew. Their target was a 65-year-old grandmother whose polite smile and everyday routines had hidden a shocking truth. Her name was Deborah Mason, but in the underworld, she was known by a far darker alias, Queen Bee. For months, detectives had tracked her family network. Encrypted signal chats revealed orders signed with her codename. Couriers crisscrossed the country, delivering consignments of cocaine to cities including Bradford, Leicester, Birmingham, Bristol, and Cardiff. Stash houses held kilos stacked like warehouse stock, ready to fuel Britain's insatiable appetite for Class A drugs. When officers finally smashed through Mason's front door, they ended an operation that had trafficked nearly a ton of cocaine in just 7 months. At wholesale, the value was up to $35 million. On the street, it reached a staggering $80 million, about $107 million. The story was irresistible to the press. Tabloids dubbed her Gangster Granny. Photographs showed her being led away in handcuffs, an image that clashed with everything the public thought they knew about drug kingpins. She was not a tattooed gangster or shadowy cartel boss, but a grandmother who had transformed her home into the hub of a multi-million-pound empire. What the raids revealed shocked even seasoned detectives. A family conspiracy led by a matriarch who turned her children, her sister, and her closest friends into lieutenants and couriers. The case would expose the scale of Britain's cocaine economy and how it could be hidden behind the most unlikely of faces. This is the story of Deborah Mason, the so-called Gangster Granny, and how her cocaine empire collapsed. The case of Deborah Mason, dubbed Gangster Granny by the press, quickly became one of the most extraordinary drug prosecutions in recent British history. What set it apart was not just the staggering scale of the operation, but the face at the center of it, a grandmother who had quietly built and led an empire that prosecutors described as industrial. Between April and November 2023, Mason and her network trafficked close to a metric ton of cocaine. The supply chain reached across the country, with consignments delivered from London to Bradford, Leicester, Birmingham, Bristol, and Cardiff. Wholesale, the cocaine was valued between $23 and $35 million. On the street, the figure swelled to around $80 million, about $107 million. Her operation was rooted in family. Using the encrypted messaging service Signal, Mason coordinated her children, her sister, and trusted friends. She appeared in chat logs under the alias Queen Bee, issuing instructions and overseeing logistics. Couriers drove consignments across county lines, while stash houses kept kilos ready for distribution. Ledgers, later recovered by police, tracked the profits from sales. The conspiracy's cover was its ordinariness. Neighbors in Tufnell Park described Mason as a polite, unremarkable woman. Yet inside her home, she directed one of the largest family-run drug conspiracies the UK had ever seen. Investigators later revealed her source was a supplier known only as Bugsy, who provided the bulk cocaine later moved through her network. The money fueled a taste for luxury. Among the evidence was a $400 Gucci collar and lead for her Bengal cat, Ghost, as well as plans for cosmetic surgery in Turkey and holidays abroad. These details made headlines, underlining how profits from crime translated into personal indulgence. In May 2024, coordinated dawn raids brought the network crashing down. Mason was arrested alongside her relatives and associates. A year later, in July 25, she stood in the dock at Woolwich Crown Court, convicted of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her co-defendants together received sentences totaling 106 years and 6 months. The case captured public attention because it overturned expectations of who could run a cartel. A grandmother had become the face of Britain's cocaine trade. Little is publicly known about the early life of Deborah Mason. What is clear, confirmed through court proceedings, is that by 2023 she had established herself as the central figure in a vast, family-run cocaine conspiracy. Mason was 65 years old when police closed in. To the outside world, She seemed like an ordinary grandmother living in Tufnell Park, North London. To the underworld, she was Queen Bee, the alias she used in encrypted signal chats to direct the network. Prosecutors described her as the driving force behind an operation of industrial scale. The conspiracy was built on blood ties and close relationships. Mason's children played key roles as trusted couriers and lieutenants. They collected consignments, arranged movements, and ensured that cocaine shipments moved from London to other cities including Bradford, Leicester, Birmingham, Bristol, and Cardiff. These trips were carried out in ordinary vehicles, designed to blend into daily life while transporting packages worth tens of thousands of pounds. Her sister was also drawn into the scheme, serving as an intermediary and helping to manage logistics. Trusted family friends acted as couriers and stash keepers, responsible for holding and delivering the drugs on Mason's orders. Every role within the organization was filled by someone Mason knew personally, creating a network bound together by loyalty, secrecy, and fear of exposure. The group's supply line came through a contact known as Bugsy, who provided the cocaine in bulk. Mason and her relatives then coordinated its onward distribution. Investigators later found ledgers and financial records tying the network to millions of pounds in profits. At the center of this system was Mason herself. Although she rarely handled the drugs directly, evidence showed she gave the instructions, monitored progress, and kept ultimate control. Messages recovered from encrypted phones revealed her directing operations with the authority of a cartel boss. In court, prosecutors made it clear this was not a case of a grandmother caught on the margins, but a matriarch who deliberately orchestrated a major supply chain. What made the case remarkable was the contrast between Mason's public image and her private role. Neighbors described her as polite, quiet, and unremarkable. Yet hidden behind that facade was a woman commanding a network that trafficked nearly a ton of cocaine in 7 months. When the case came before Woolwich Crown Court, prosecutors emphasized the unusual character of the conspiracy. It was not a stereotypical gang marked by violence and turf wars, but a family-run cartel, operating in plain sight, led by a grandmother who used trust and kinship to mask large-scale criminality. The cocaine network, led by Deborah Mason, was described in court as an operation of industrial scale. It was built on trust, secrecy, and the ordinary routines of family life, which masked the extraordinary sums of money and quantities of drugs that passed through it. At the center was Mason, directing the conspiracy from her home in Tufnell Park, North London. Using the encrypted messaging app Signal, she issued instructions under her alias, Queen Bee. The court heard how her children, her sister, and trusted friends acted on those instructions, each playing a role that gave the group the structure of a cartel. The supply came from a man known only as Bugsy. He provided bulk quantities of cocaine, which Mason's associates collected and prepared for onward distribution. From there, the drugs moved through a network of couriers who drove them from London to major regional centers, including Bradford, Leicester, Birmingham, Bristol, and Cardiff. Vehicles that looked like those of any family going about daily errands were in fact transporting consignments worth thousands of pounds at a time. The cocaine was stored in stash houses across the country. When police raided these locations, they discovered kilos of cocaine, cash counting machines, packaging materials, and ledgers detailing transactions. These finds gave prosecutors the evidence to describe the operation as not just significant, but massive in scale. The money trail reflected the size of the enterprise. Profits from sales ran into the tens of millions, while some of this cash was hidden away. Other parts were spent on luxury items. Among the evidence presented in court were purchases including a 400 Gucci collar and lead for Mason's Bengal cat, Ghost. She also planned for cosmetic surgery in Turkey and holidays abroad, including Dubai. These indulgences became symbols of how the proceeds of crime were funneled into her personal life. Unlike many traditional gangs, the Mason network was not built on violence or territorial disputes. Instead, it relied on its low profile. There were no drive-by shootings or public displays of force. Its strength was in visibility, a family presenting itself as ordinary while secretly trafficking cocaine on a national scale. Over just 7 months between April and November 2023, the group moved close to a ton of cocaine. Prosecutors valued its wholesale worth at $23 to $35 million, with a potential street value of $80 million, about $107 million. The precision of the operation, its reach across England and Wales, and the family structure that bound it together made it one of the most striking drug conspiracies ever uncovered in the UK. The dismantling of Deborah Mason's empire was the result of a meticulous investigation led by the Metropolitan Police Specialist Crime Command. Detectives first became aware of the scale of the operation in 2023, when large consignments of cocaine were detected, moving from London into regional markets. Patterns emerged. The shipments were regular, coordinated, and far larger than what would normally be linked to street-level gangs. Initial suspicions did not point to Mason. The idea that a grandmother could be orchestrating such a conspiracy seemed implausible, but intelligence soon pointed towards her Tufnell Park home, and the communications traffic traced by investigators revealed something extraordinary: an alias, Queen Bee, appearing consistently in signal chats that coordinated the supply chain. The challenge for police was building a watertight case. Organized crime of this magnitude depends on silence and trust, and in Mason's network, loyalty was reinforced by blood ties. Her children, her sister, and close associates were all part of the conspiracy, making it unlikely that anyone would talk. To secure convictions, detectives needed more than suspicion. They needed direct evidence. Through months of surveillance, they tracked the movement of vehicles and identified stash houses. When these were eventually searched, officers uncovered cocaine, packaging equipment, cash counting machines, and ledgers. These discoveries were critical, tying the group to industrial-level trafficking rather than isolated dealing. Another decisive breakthrough came when police seized and examined encrypted devices. From these, investigators recovered thousands of signal messages, mapping journeys, transactions, and instructions. The handle Queen Bee was central in these communications, directing the group's activity. Combined with surveillance footage and seized materials, it placed Mason firmly at the heart of the conspiracy. As the evidence mounted, detectives faced the question of timing. Striking too early risked Mason claiming she was peripheral, a grandmother unaware of her relatives' activities. By holding back, the Met allowed the conspiracy to continue under watch, gathering enough evidence to prove she was the architect. By early 2024, the net was ready to close. The investigation had exposed not just couriers and stash houses, but the matriarch who commanded them, Mason, who neighbors regarded as ordinary, had been unmasked in the evidence as the leader of one of the UK's most significant family-run drug conspiracies. The investigation into Deborah Mason's network reached its critical moment in the closing months of 2023. By then, detectives from the Metropolitan Police Specialist Crime Command had mapped the structure of the conspiracy. They had evidence of consignments moving from London to Bradford, Leicester, Birmingham, Bristol, and Cardiff. They had tracked couriers, identified stash houses, and followed the trail of money. What they needed was conclusive proof that Mason herself, known in encrypted communications as Queen Bee, was at the center. That proof came from the recovery of encrypted signal messages. When police seized devices linked to Mason's couriers and relatives, they discovered thousands of communications that laid bare the conspiracy. The chats showed journeys being planned, deliveries confirmed, and instructions issued. At the heart of these conversations was the alias Queen Bee. Prosecutors later told Woolwich Crown Court that this was Mason, directing operations from her home in Tufnell Park. The seizure of stash houses reinforced the picture. In these locations, officers found kilos of cocaine, packaging equipment, cash counting machines, and ledgers recording transactions. The materials proved that the group was not handling small quantities, but operating at a scale measured in hundreds of kilos. Together, these discoveries marked the turning point. What began as suspicion had become certainty. The digital evidence tied Mason directly to the flow of drugs and money. The physical seizures showed the industrial scale of the trade, and surveillance confirmed the roles of her children, her sister, and her friends in carrying out her orders. By early 2024, the case against Mason was strong enough to withstand any challenge in court. Detectives decided the time had come to act. If they waited longer, the network would continue pumping cocaine into Britain's streets. If they struck too soon, Mason could argue she was a bystander. Now, with encrypted messages, seized drugs, and financial records, the case portrayed her not as a grandmother caught in the background, but as the mastermind of one of the UK's most significant family-run drug conspiracies. The next step would be decisive: the coordinated raids that would bring her empire crashing down. In May 2024, the Metropolitan Police launched a series of coordinated dawn raids that brought Deborah Mason's network to an abrupt end. After months of surveillance, seized devices, and evidence from stash houses, detectives were confident that the conspiracy could be proved in court. The operation targeted multiple addresses across London and beyond, including Mason's own home in Tufnell Park, North London. Armed officers forced entry in the early hours. Inside, they found Mason, the woman known in encrypted signal chats as Queen Bee, and placed her under arrest. What looked like an ordinary grandmother to her neighbors was, in the eyes of the investigators, the mastermind of one of the largest family-run drug conspiracies the UK had ever uncovered. At the same time, her children, her sister, and close associates were also arrested at linked addresses. Couriers were detained, and stash houses were searched. Police recovered cocaine, packaging materials, ledgers, and cash counting machines. The synchronized action ensured that the network was dismantled in a single sweep, preventing anyone from escaping or destroying evidence. Later in the year, in November 2024, one further defendant was arrested, completing the lineup of those accused of taking part in the conspiracy. In total, 8 people stood charged alongside Mason, all of them either family members or trusted friends drawn into the criminal enterprise. The raids shocked the community. Neighbors who had considered Mason polite and ordinary were confronted with the sight of armed police removing her in handcuffs. For detectives, the arrests marked the culmination of a long and painstaking investigation. The grandmother who appeared unremarkable in public had been unmasked as the central figure of a multi-million-pound cocaine empire. The evidence seized during the raids, combined with the thousands of encrypted messages already gathered, would become the foundation of the Crown's case. From that moment forward, the question was no longer whether Mason would face trial, but how the court would respond to the sheer scale of the conspiracy she had directed. The trial of Deborah Mason took place at Woolwich Crown Court in 2025 and revealed in detail the scale of the conspiracy. At 65 years old, Mason was accused of directing a family-run cartel that prosecutors described as operating on an industrial scale. Prosecutors presented the evidence gathered over months of investigation. Thousands of signal messages recovered from seized devices showed Mason, under the alias Queen Bee, issuing instructions and coordinating movements of cocaine. Surveillance had linked her home in Tufnell Park directly to the conspiracy. Raids on stash houses produced kilos of cocaine, packaging equipment, cash counting machines, and ledgers recording millions of pounds in transactions. The jury also heard how Mason had drawn her children, her sister, and trusted friends into the enterprise, making it one of the largest family-run drug conspiracies ever uncovered in the United Kingdom. The Crown argued that Mason was not a peripheral figure, but the mastermind, the driving force at the center of the network. Her defense sought to downplay her role, suggesting she was less central to the operation. But prosecutors countered with the volume of digital evidence and physical seizures, showing that Mason exercised authority over every part of the chain, from supply, through distribution, to the laundering of profits. On 28 April 2025, Mason was convicted of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs. On 18 July 2025, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Alongside her, 7 relatives and associates received sentences ranging from several years to more than a decade, amounting in total to 106 years and 6 months. The judge described the case as a serious breach of trust. Mason had not only built a criminal network, but had involved her own family in sustaining it. For a woman once regarded by neighbors as polite and ordinary, the contrast between public image and private reality could not have been more stark. The conviction of Deborah Mason marked the end of one of the most unusual drug conspiracies in recent British history. Over a span of just 7 months, her family-run network had trafficked almost a ton of cocaine, with a potential street value of $80 million. At 65 years old, Mason was unmasked not as an ordinary grandmother, but as the Queen Bee of an operation prosecutors described as industrial. Her sentencing in July 2025, 20 years in prison, with a combined total of 106 years and 6 months for her relatives and associates, sent a strong message about the reach of organized crime. It also underscored the extraordinary paradox at the center of the case. A grandmother who turned her children, her sister, and her friends into participants in one of the UK's largest cocaine conspiracies. The story resonated far beyond the courtroom. Neighbors who had once described Mason as polite and unremarkable were forced to reconcile that image with her role as the mastermind of a multi-million-pound cartel. For law enforcement, the case highlighted both the hidden scale of Britain's cocaine economy and the need for patient, methodical investigations to bring down those who direct it. Yet questions linger. While Mason's network has been dismantled, the supply chain that brought such vast quantities of cocaine into Britain remains. Was Mason truly the top of the pyramid, or just the visible face of something larger?